Donald Trump, whether by design or the accident of history, is now a war president. While some of the coverage has been overshadowed by a certain political controversy, Trump is engaged on multiple fronts, including, of course, the attack on Iran's nuclear sites. Then there's the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The president had, for some reason, given Vladimir Putin 50 days to change his behavior or face sanctions. But with the Russian dictator continuing to bombard Ukraine, showing no conceivable interest in peace, Trump moved up the deadline.
On Russia, earlier you said that you were going to change the deadline from 50 days.
Yeah,
what is your new deadline?
I'm going to make a new deadline of about 10 or 12 days from today. There's no reason in waiting.
The president has also been trying to broker a ceasefire between Hamas, which launched the brutal and barbaric attack on October 7th, and continues in a war crime to hold the 20 hostages who are still alive. But there is mass starvation in Gaza, and Trump has broken with Bibi Netanyahu on that mounting humanitarian crisis.
Mr. President, Prime Minister Netanyahu said there's no starvation in Gaza. Do you agree with that assessment?
I don't know. I mean, based on television, I would say not particularly, because those children look very hungry.
But we're going to be getting some good, strong food. We can save a lot of people. I mean, some of those kids that's real starvation stuff. I see it. And you can't fake that.
The president also spoke to the leaders of Thailand and Cambodia and arranged a ceasefire after deadly fighting had broken out. So some detractors are hardly pleased with the involvement of a president who ran on staying out of wars. But as with George W. Bush after 9/11, which unfortunately led to the quagmire in Iraq, history often chooses the crises to which an American commander-in-chief must respond. And that's where the president finds himself today. I'm Howard Kurtz, and this is Media Buzz. Across the media spectrum, the debate is heating up about the president, Bibi Netanyahu, and how the heart-rending images of emaciated children are affecting American support for Israel.
The only people feeding the Palestinians there are the United States and the Israelis. Imagine that. Imagine that. The Israelis who were slaughtered, the Israelis who were attacked, are now told that they need to do a better job in feeding the people who Hamas are starving and killing. That's nuts.
Benjamin Netanyahu ignoring the president time and again. Benjamin Netanyahu doing what he thinks is in his best political interest.
It's truly unclear who Donald Trump thinks should be thanking him, although I do feel sorry that he feels bad. Maybe the starving Palestinians in Gaza?
The president's new deadline for moving against Russia also making headlines.
The president has changed his policy from a completely diplomatic approach that lasted for weeks and months and really didn't get us anywhere because Putin was not going to cooperate.
The reason he's turning on Putin right now is because he keeps talking peace and then bombing people and killing people, killing civilians, bombing nursing homes, bombing schools.
He's bumping up against the reality of someone like Putin.
Joining us now to analyze the coverage, Mollie Hemingway, Fox News contributor and editor-in-chief of The Federalist, and Annie Linskey, White House correspondent for The Wall Street Journal. Mollie, wars tend to fade into the media background when they've been going on for a long time, but with the starvation in Gaza, that's put a new spotlight, I think, on President Trump's efforts.
Well, it's certainly difficult for the media to cover war. By definition, it's a difficult environment to be in. There's also so much propaganda from all sides that are engaged in a war. And I think we've seen some real problems with how they've covered both of these wars. With the Israel situation, I mean, just like the reporter saying, Netanyahu says there's no starving. I mean, didn't he more say the starving is the result of how Hamas is controlling the food supply, which is different than saying there's no starving. And then with the Russian situation, we had a media that was just engaged in full-on cheerleading about entering, moving away from a negotiated ceasefire. They were kind of celebrating how easy it would be to take on Russia. We're years into this. It has been a horrific war with more than 1 million casualties, and we don't really get a lot of coverage of how deadly it has been, and also how Russia is a nuclear power. They have thousands of nuclear warheads. They don't have to accept a conventional end of a war, and that is resulting in some of these problems in actually getting to an agreement. I just think the level of coverage we're getting is unserious, and then also limited by how much they can actually see what's happening.
And Hamas, which bears a lot of the responsibility here,
Yes.
and uses its own people as human shields, by the way, leads me to the New York Times, and we can briefly put this up. It had to run an embarrassing correction after running this picture of an emaciated child, and then we later learn that this child was already sick and had pre-existing conditions.
Yeah, I mean, that was a difficult moment for the New York Times. Look, the broader point, though, is that journalists are not permitted in Gaza. And to Mollie's point, covering a war is difficult, just on the face of it. But when journalists are barred from getting into the place and covering it on the ground, that does become more difficult. The Journal has experienced that firsthand in Russia, where we had a journalist who was there on the ground covering the impact of the war, on the domestic impact of the war in Russia, and was locked up for quite some time. So that changed how the Journal had to cover the war. But these are difficult. It's difficult to cover. And so what I think has happened is the people who are there are able to take pictures and are getting some of those images out. And these images are flooding social media. And the way that this war in Gaza is being consumed is just so different from any other war that we've had. So
well, I just want to add one point to that picture. It's worse than finding out that this child actually had lifelong health problems that led to what his situation is there. The New York Times cropped out the healthy sibling that was right next to that child. I mean, to do that kind of, that is so dishonest what they're doing there. And then also, they're not showing the pictures of hostages. Hamas also released a picture of a hostage yesterday who's completely emaciated, Abiatar David, I think his name was. And we're not getting flooded with those images. We're not seeing the pressure on the fact that Hamas is still holding, maybe 24 hostages, others who they killed, who they haven't released the bodies. And normally the media care about hostages, but it hasn't been a big storyline, and that's also a problem for the country.
Yeah, although some Israelis are now saying we need to focus more on the hostages, and there's some rollback against the prime minister. Do you see Donald Trump in the White House becoming frustrated at the amount of attention he gets, except when it's something dramatic like bombing Iran, for these foreign policy moves? Because you also see a lot of the questions being shouted out, as we'll discuss next segment, about Jeffrey Epstein.
I think one of the striking things here, just watching the video footage at the beginning of this segment, was that the president was in Scotland, meeting with a foreign leader when this question of Gaza and hunger in Gaza came up. And this is a president who was ostensibly on vacation, but having a meeting. No such thing with this president. So in journalism, you're kind of used to when the president is on vacation having a little bit of a reprieve. But here he was making major news on one war while he was meeting with a leader from another foreign country. So look, I do think this president is I think his foreign policy has been center in the coverage of him, in part because it's every single week you're seeing a new foreign leader, and in many cases there have been significant peace agreements that he has brokered. And I do think when I think about the Journal, we've been covering that pretty consistently.
The media have said all along that Vladimir Putin has no conceivable interest in peace. Obviously, the attacks on Ukraine, and with the new deadline that'd be just a few days, perhaps, before, and even the president said doesn't know if that will be effective. But were the media right all along that Putin was not going to cooperate with any kind of settlement?
The media have covered this war horrifically. You might remember that at the very beginning they were claiming that Putin was a madman who was about to die within months. Do you remember that storyline that was happening early on? They were saying that was he was so irrational. Never have the media accurately understood the underlying issues with the war with Ukraine. I mean, this is something that goes back decades. Putin has had a long history of talking about, how this was going to happen. Trump had a very different posture toward Russia. And of course, we also had the breaking news over the last 2 weeks with all of it coming out about the Russia collusion hoax and how that was completely invented, not just by Obama's spy chiefs, but it was handled by the media to increase tensions between Russia and the United States. We've had all sorts of news breaking about how that hoax went down, how many people knew that they were lying when they falsely claimed that Russia had interfered in the election to help Trump. I mean, this is a global power that you don't want to have lies being told about. And our media were engaged in nothing but lies on that topic for years. They won Pulitzers for telling lies about the Russia collusion hoax. And now that we have all this news coming out about what really happened and that they were lies, that they were knowing lies, that people within the government were trying to stop these lies from being pushed out into the public square, now the media aren't really covering it at all, even though it's like the most massive story ever about what we're learning in the last couple of weeks.
I would just point out that I have absolutely no doubt that the Obama administration politicized this, but there was a special counsel in the first term, John Durham, who ended up not bringing any charges against Obama, John Brennan, and these other people.
But your viewers should know that there have been so many documents that have come out in the last couple of weeks from.
But Durham had those documents and didn't bring any charges.
No, he actually did not investigate as well as should have been done. And there are so many more things that have come out, particularly from John Brennan and James Clapper. New documents showing that people, and I broke some stories about this at the Federalist, showing that people within those agencies were actually screaming from the rooftops, you can't make these false claims. And they had their jobs threatened, or they were told that there was secret intelligence that they didn't know about. I mean, this is really horrific stuff and major news. And it's why the media aren't trusted, because they're willing to lie about things like this. And then when the truth comes out, they don't cover it at all.
So this is now tied into the tariff war, Annie,
Yes.
because the president said that he was not giving any kind of break to Canada because Prime Minister Mark Carney is about to come out for recognizing a Palestinian state. The UK has done that. France is about to do that. Of course, it's all symbolic. We're further than we've ever been from a, quote, two-state solution. But at the same time, he's given a temporary reprieve to Mexico. So it all gets
the relationship with Mexico, I think, is one of the most fascinating bilateral relationships that Trump has forged. One of the things when I think about Trump's foreign policy and the way he's dealing with leaders, I keep thinking back to the speech that he gave in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia when he said, I don't want permanent enemies. And that gets back to this sort of, 19th century idea of no permanent enemies, no permanent friends, but permanent interests. And I think that is how Trump is rejiggering foreign policy writ large, whether it's Gaza and his relationship with Netanyahu and his willingness to stand up to Netanyahu and disagree with him when that
quite publicly,
quite publicly when he feels appropriate, agree with him in other areas where he feels it's appropriate. I know I will say that I've been with Trump many times when he talks about Gaza, and he always talks about the hostages. He always talks about the hostages first, and he points out that when he's talked to the hostages and hostage families that have had their loved ones returned, he always asks, was there anybody who was kind to you? Or was there anybody that gave you food, that winked, that smiled? And they say no. And that really hits him hard.
On the domestic front, President Trump getting a lot of media flack for firing the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Erica McIntyre, a Biden appointee, for reporting just job growth of just 73,000 in July and revising downward by 258,000 jobs the last couple of months. Now, I would point out that this is actually pretty routine. More information comes in, and this happened also during the Biden administration. So some critics, including Kevin O'Leary of Shark Tank, saying he's shooting the messenger, and that may turn into a bigger story as well.
I'm Steve Doocy.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.